Okay, welcome all the distinguished speakers and the guests from UK and other countries today for a joint conference of Uniting for Peace and Global Alliance for Ministries and Infrastructure for Peace. The title of the conference is Wars, Inequality and Poverty, Ways Out of the Vicious Circle. The format for the evening is that all the distinguished speakers will speak 10, 12, maximum 15 minutes, and it will be followed by 1 hour question-answer session. I would like the audience and the speakers to reflect on the following. As Iran is bombed for the 12th night, and Iran is bombing its neighboring countries, and conflicts are raging in 120 countries around the globe, including Iran, Ukraine, Gaza, Lebanon, and Sudan, resulting in untold suffering and challenging the international order. These crises have underscored the fragility of global peace mechanisms and raised questions about the effectiveness of institutions like the United Nations in preventing and resolving conflicts. I would request the distinguished speakers to reflect on how we can revive and rejuvenate the peace movement to be more effective for building a more peaceful and safer world. So, first, I am the speaker and I'm going to take my 10 minutes. And then I'll be followed by Rebecca, Sean English, Alan Ben Mayer. I can see they're all here, except Richard Falk, but maybe he joined us a bit late. So, dear friends, I'm going to speak on the war machine that feeds on itself. While the world carries on business as usual, humanity moves from one tragedy to another. Iran, Ukraine, Gaza, Lebanon, Sudan, Yemen. Bodies scattered, families broken, cities in ruins. Armed conflict is now a defining feature of our time. Across continents, the rules meant to protect civilians in war are being stretched, ignored, dismantled, conflicts spread. They last longer, grow more complex, and civilians, the very people international law exists to protect, suffer the most. This is what the head of the International Red Cross had to say. If what we are seeing in Gaza, Eastern Congo, Sudan, and Ukraine is the future of war, we should all be extremely concerned, as this would shake the very foundations of our humanity. Dear friends, I'd like to give you a figure, 2.89 trillion. That is what the world spent on militaries on 2025. In a world where close to 800 million people go to bed hungry every night, and where universal primary education for every child would cost roughly $26 billion a year. I did not invent this figure or this contrast. I want you to hold both of them simultaneously and ask yourself, how is this not the central scandal of our time? As former US President Dwight D. Eisenhower said, Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. Eisenhower was not a radical or a peace activist. He was a five-star general who had commanded the liberation of Europe. He understood from inside, because he was an inside man, what militarism really costs. His warning was ignored in the decades since. The machine he warned about has grown larger, bigger, more sophisticated, more deeply embedded. The five permanent members of the UN Security Council are also, not coincidentally, the world's five largest arms exporters. This is not an irony. That is the system working exactly as intended. So, who pays and who profits from this war business? Military spending does not merely divert resources from the poor, it concentrates wealth among the already wealthy and uses that power to keep the cycle turning. As another US President, Franklin D. Roosevelt, said, the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. Think about who fights our wars. Overwhelmingly young people from deprived backgrounds, disadvantaged backgrounds, not because they are more courageous, but because they have fewer alternatives. We have built militaries that function in practice as a poverty tax. In my book, The Economics of Killing, I describe how globalization and the extraction of resources from poor countries traps the developing world in a cycle of perpetual violence and poverty. The theft countries are meant by political. The poor people are blamed for being poor and architects of their own poverty. And it's a vicious circle, as we have said in our title. So the vicious circle is, let me name the circle itself, the mechanism, because naming is the first step to breaking it. Powerful interests lobby for high military spending. That spending starves the public goods, education, healthcare, housing. That reduce inequality. Inequality grows, communities fracture, instability follows, and that instability is used to justify the next round of spending, and the vicious circle continues. But, dear friends, the circle is not a law of nature. It's a political choice, and political choices can be unmade. Costa Rica is a great example, who abolished its military in 1948 and redirected savings into education, healthcare. And it has higher literacy, longer life expectancy, and greater stability, many of its marginalized, militarized labors. After the Cold War, as I have described in my another book, Peace Beyond Borders, European nations that cut defense spending and reinvested in civilian infrastructure, saw their populations grow healthier, better educated, more productive. Peace is not economically naive. It is on the evidence the better investment. Ending extreme poverty would cost roughly $175 billion a year, less than 10% of the current global military spending. Every pound spent on conflict prevention saves, on conservative estimates, 16 pounds, according to World Bank and UK government research. Dear friends, within living memory, colonialism was called the natural order. Apartheid, a political necessity. Neither proved immovable. We got rid of them because enough people decided they would not accept them. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Dear friends, we are not powerless. Citizens can ask how their representatives vote on arms licenses. Journalists can investigate and scrutinize defense lobbying as rigorously as they scrutinize welfare fraud. Investors can apply ethical screens. Our goal should be simple: to make it politically impossible for leaders to start or continue wars. In my book, How Not to Go to War, I argue for a department for peace and a minister for peace and disarmament at cabinet level, whose task is to exhaust dialogue and diplomacy before any decision to go to war. Freeing the savings for healthcare, jobs, and real security through the pillars of peace, 4 pillars of peace. I call them 4 Ds: disarmament, demilitarization, development, and democracy. We can build economies that profit from human flourishing rather than human suffering, spending less on war and more on aid, cooperation, rule of law, and a culture of peace. Just remember, dear friends, power concedes nothing without dissent. The suffragettes movement for the women's right to vote proved that that is not a luxury, it's an essential condition for our survival. A better world is possible. Let's try building it. Thank you. Okay, let's start our first speaker. Is Richard Falk in the audience?
Yes.
You are. Hello,
Yeah,
Richard.
I had trouble. I apologize. I was late because I had trouble finding the link, and
Oh, dear.
so I missed your presentation.
Okay. I'm very happy you are here. And for people who don't know, I know Richard for at least 30 to 40 years. And he's endorsed my books in the past. Okay. Richard is a former professor of international law, Princeton University, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. Please welcome Richard Falk. Richard, floor is yours for 12 to 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Vijay. It's good to be reconnected with you after a long time.
Yeah,
And the theme of this conference is very challenging. And I'm not sure how best to approach it. My sense is that in the immediate situation, which is dangerous and destructive, the onset of war, at least in the area of West Asia or the Middle East, particularly with reference to Gaza and to Iran, is not a consequence of poverty or inequality. That the wars are the wars of what I would call naked aggression. And they have, in the Israel Gaza context, a genocidal dimension. And they're not wars that have been provoked by massive unrest of people that are dissatisfied with their own circumstances, which may be conditions of impoverishment and certainly of inequality. What these wars have done is to reinforce these two other dimensions of the title of our conference. They have made the situation of the poor everywhere, including in countries such as my own, the United States, suffer more from the diversion of resources to this kind of military geopolitics, and because of the pushback that has been associated with the resilience and resistance of Iran in particular, but that has blunted the consequences of aggression, at least temporarily, but at the cost of increased hardship for vulnerable people throughout the world. And that vulnerability is partly accentuated by the degree to which inequality has come about as a result of the rise of what I and others have called finance capitalism, replacing the kind of industrial capitalism that preceded it. And the reason that has produced this kind of unprecedented inequality between and within countries is largely a result of the fact that the tendencies of capitalism in this post-Cold War period have accentuated two things. First, it's a pursuit of profitability rather than a wealth generated by industrial development. And that kind of finance capitalism is a way of making the rich richer and stagnating the poor or making them even poorer. In my own lifetime, the standard of living of the bottom 90% of Americans is worse than it was in my childhood, despite enormous increases in the gross national product of the country. So what has happened is this concentration of wealth at one end of the demographic spectrum. And the other dimension is a increase in the relationship between the militarized state and the private sector arms industry, which again drains wealth from the countries, and I'm thinking in this context again, particularly of the United States, but also of the other geopolitical actors. It privileges military expenditures over investments in domestic infrastructure and social well-being. So you find governments that are heavily invested in this militarist geopolitics at the expense of not only the targets of the militarism, but as de facto punitive impacts on their own populations. So it contributes not only to inequality, but to autocracy, because it's necessary with these widening gaps to create scapegoats and to impose very repressive measures on the society itself. So you have a deterioration of democratic governance and a whole cascade of dislocations at this time with very dangerous forms of rivalry between Russia and the United States in relation to Europe and Ukraine, which have a significant danger of producing escalation that might spill over into threats and even uses of nuclear weapons. So we meet at a very dangerous time for which there are very few constructive forces in the most important countries of the world, in which the UN has been sidelined essentially, and which the only relatively hopeful actor has been China. China, which has done extraordinary things to overcome poverty and to some extent inequality, though it has a degree of inequality, and it has managed to evolve as a leading country, maybe the leading country when it comes to technological innovation without any reliance on military expansion. It's an extremely important alternative way of achieving influence, prosperity, and contributing at the same time to win-win situations around the world where it is helping countries develop their own infrastructure and has shown its willingness not to intervene in their internal political life and provides something that the West could learn from instead of trying to engage in a mutually destructive rivalry. So what I'm trying to express is that if we're really serious about this theme of war, poverty, and inequality, we would look to China as the most positive path, a road not taken by the West. And it's a time when civil society initiatives of this kind should assert their distrust of political realism that rests on militarist geopolitics, which has been the colonial and imperial path taken by the West to dominate much of the non-West. So we're in a crisis point, an inflection that gives a certain kind of choice as to which path to go on. Shall we continue on this militarist path of finance capitalism, or should we try to adapt to a world which is premised on mutual benefits, reciprocal collective action to deal with common challenges such as the ecological agenda poses? So let me conclude by saying that we are without any basis for hope, but we must be hopeful in this moment and pursue the best possible solution. Let me stop there.
Vijay, your muses.
I'm muted.
I don't know.
Can
No,
you hear
I'm not
me?
muted.
You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. Most of the points Richard made, I agree. The capitalists are financing the military, and from military they are gaining, becoming more and more richer. And China is a good example, who have chosen to invest in their own country and got at least 600 to 700 million people better off. And thank you very much, Richard. And probably you will get some questions to answer later. Our next speaker is Rebecca Schult. You are there, Rebecca, aren't you?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, good. Co-convener, Washington Working Group for the International Criminal Court. Co-convener, Impact coalition on strengthening international judicial institutions. And moreover, let me add that she's very active. I find her very active on the peace movement and always traveling. Please welcome Rebecca Schultz.
Thank you so much. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It is a true privilege to join such distinguished speakers. And my sincere thanks to Dr. Mehta, GAMIP, and Uniting for Peace for convening this important conversation. I believe Bernie has some slides that you will screen share. They will be brief. And I will say that it's particularly meaningful as Bernie gets the slides up to join you today from my hometown of New York. I'm just across the street from the United Nations headquarters at a moment of profound change for the international system. This is an extraordinary period in the life of the United Nations. We're implementing the Pact for the Future, while civil society also advances its complementary vision through the People's Pact for the Future. I can include links in the chat after I speak. We're also approaching the selection of the next Secretary General at a time when confidence in multilateralism is under unprecedented strain. So the question is no longer simply how to reform our institutions, but whether the post-war international order can evolve to meet the realities of today. And these realities are testing many of the Charter's foundational premises. The prohibition on the use of force, the peaceful settlement of disputes, respect for international law, the protection of civilians, human rights, and international cooperation. And international courts and tribunals have themselves become targets of political attack and coercion. But rather than seeing this moment solely as a crisis, I believe we should see it as a crucible, an opportunity not to abandon the vision of 1945, but to renew it. And so the title of today's conference, Wars, Inequality, and Poverty, Ways Out of the Vicious Circle, I think captures one of the defining challenges of our time. We are living
May I interrupt you, Rebecca?
Yes, Bernie.
Sorry to interrupt you, Rebecca. Can you see your slide presentation?
I can. Thank you. And if you could,
can everybody else see it? Yeah.
Yes,
yes.
needs to be on
Lovely.
slide.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt you. Just
No,
wanted to
not at all. Thank you for
make
the
sure
technical.
that everything runs smoothly. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. If you could play it as a slideshow now so that it expands to the full screen, I think that would be helpful for the audience.
Let me see now. Play.
Yes,
Right, hold on.
that should be the magic button, I think.
That one, yeah.
That would be the one. Okay, that
Right,
works for me. Hopefully it works for others.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Bernie, for your technical assistance.
Most welcome.
So as the title of this opening slide suggests, what I'm here to suggest this evening is that to address these intersecting, cascading, and mutually reinforcing crises, we need the same interconnected responses. And so I'm going to suggest 5 institutional investments that can help reimagine the architecture of peace for the 21st century. And so with that, I think we can move to the next slide, rather. So the first institutional investment is to strengthen peaceful dispute settlement, i.e. to invest in law before conflict becomes war. I think this is probably the most preventative and perhaps ultimately the most cost-effective of these investments that I'm going to present to you today. This isn't a new idea by any means. This is one of the founding principles of the United Nations. Article 2.3 of the Charter requires states to settle disputes by peaceful means, while Article 33 identifies negotiation, mediation, arbitration, judicial settlement, and other peaceful mechanisms as alternatives to force. And at the heart of this whole system stands the International Court of Justice, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. And this commitment has actually recently been reaffirmed. Just last year, the Security Council, the General Assembly unanimously called for renewed efforts to strengthen mechanisms for the peaceful settlement of disputes, while the Secretary General described peaceful settlement as the lifeline of the Charter at a time of escalating geopolitical tensions. So the commitment is there, but the challenge is implementation. Although every UN member state is party to the statute of the ICJ, Only 75 states have accepted its compulsory jurisdiction under Articles 36(2). And as a result, many disputes could only be heard if states consent after a dispute has already arisen. And that's precisely when positions hardened and diplomacy becomes more difficult. And so there is currently an initiative working with governments, legal experts, and civil society partners called Legal Alternatives to War to encourage broader acceptance of compulsory jurisdiction as a practical investment in conflict prevention. So this is not about replacing diplomacy, but about strengthening diplomacy. So this is an investment in prevention, in diplomacy, and in peace. Because peace begins when states have credible alternatives to fighting in the first place. So with this, I'll move to the next slide on our second institutional investment. Thanks again, Bernie. And this is with regards to closing the gaps in accountability. So completing the architecture of peace by addressing its remaining lacunae. So if our first investment was about preventing disputes from becoming wars, our second recognizes an equally important reality that prevention will not always succeed. And when it fails, accountability must be comprehensive and the law must continue evolving to meet new realities. Earlier this week, I attended the launch of my friend, Professor Jennifer Trahan's new book on the crime of aggression. And one of the Ukrainian speakers who hosted the event described aggression there as the fundamental crime from which all others emerge. I think that captures an essential truth, that aggression is the first domino that unleashes a cascade of consequences. These include war crimes, crimes against humanity, attacks on civilians and critical infrastructure, displacement, economic collapse, corruption, inequality, and instability. And yet, despite being recognized since Nuremberg as the leadership crime, accountability for aggression remains incomplete. The Kampala amendments, as they're called, to the Rome Statute, made activation of the crime of aggression possible within this system of the International Criminal Court, but only through a very carefully negotiated compromise, political compromise, that created a jurisdictional regime which is quite different from the other core crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The recently established Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine is an important and welcome step, but it's also an ad hoc response to a single conflict. And as aggression continues to affect populations across virtually every region of the world, we must strive for continued, permanent principled and universally applicable mechanisms that minimize perceptions of selectivity and ensure accountability is not dependent on geography or geopolitics. And that's why we're seeing important steps taken to harmonize the crime of aggression. At the same time, we are also seeing steps towards a Crimes Against Humanity Convention. Nearly 80 years after Nuremberg, we have codified genocide, we have codified war crimes in the Geneva Conventions, but we lack a standalone treaty beyond the Rome Statute regime for crimes against humanity. And at the same time, states parties to the Rome Statute are also considering amendments addressing ecocide, slavery, and the slave trade, all recognizing the intersectional nature of the gravest, most egregious crimes that shock the conscience of humanity. Next slide. At the same time that we are addressing the root causes of conflict through existing institutions, we must build new institutions for emerging challenges. And so this third investment looks beyond strengthening the system as it is today and think about how today's challenges exceed yesterday's institutions. So while institutions like the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court remain indispensable, they are not necessarily sufficient to meet the needs of the current moment. And I think one example that illustrates this particularly well is corruption. And very often we think of corruption as merely an economic crime, but in reality, it's also a driver of instability and conflict. It diverts resources from schools, hospital, infrastructure, sustainable development. It weakens democratic institutions. It fuels organized crime. It exacerbates inequality, and it leaves society less resilient in times of crisis. And so this is why I've been very privileged to serve on the advisory board of Integrity Initiatives International and be a part of the treaty drafting committee supporting a proposed international anti-corruption court. And this recognizes that the challenge is often not the absence of law. The UN Convention Against Corruption is almost universally ratified, but that the problem of implementation requires a court of last resort. And now more than 300 former heads of state and government, Nobel laureates, judges, ministers, parliamentarians, civil society leaders have endorsed this proposal and expressed support. So now I'll move to our last investment. Thank you. Which is second to last, to strengthen common security by reducing the use, in particular, of Security Council mechanisms like the veto to advance aggression, to perpetuate crimes against humanity and war crimes, and to block humanitarian aid. So here we see the inversion or perhaps perversion of an instrument that was in fact dedicated to ensure that the scourge of war would not impact future generations, being used for the diametric opposite. The UN Security Council veto and the Security Council itself has become the source of immense debate, and I think across the street right now, I can almost hear the reverberations of a current debate that is touching on this topic. But there is an initiative underway that does not seek to supplant or replace initiatives to revive or rejuvenate or simply reassess the configuration of the Security Council, but to validate the fact that there are already existing legal limits to the veto power. Where the veto has been used in these situations to advance atrocities or to block humanitarian aid, it is already violating the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, is violating treaty law, i.e. the Geneva Conventions, and the Genocide Convention in some instances, perhaps. And it's also violating Coven's norms, those bedrock norms that are so indispensable to our existence as a shared humanity and a shared planet that they cannot be ignored. And so there is initiative underway to seek an advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice, the World Court, on whether these limits do in fact exist, and to prevent powerful states from perpetuating atrocities by use of an instrument designed to prevent them. So now I will move to our final recommendation and investment, which is protecting the guardians of justice. And this might be the most urgent of all. None of the reforms that I have described will matter if the institutions responsible for implementing them themselves are weakened. So around the world, we're witnessing increasing attacks on judges, prosecutors, lawyers, human rights defenders, and the institutions charged with upholding the rule of law. Just a couple of weeks ago, the United States announced a campaign to dismantle the International Criminal Court, which follows sanctions on individual judges, prosecutors, human rights organizations, and the special rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories that were announced throughout the course of last year. And whatever one's views about particular decisions of that court, or indeed of any court, efforts to intimidate judges, prosecutors, counsel, or those who cooperate set a very dangerous precedent. And they do not simply affect one institution. They send a message that justice itself is negotiable. So whether directed at the ICC, the ICJ, regional courts, this should be a concern to all of us. International courts cannot function without judicial independence. International law cannot function without these institutions, and institutions cannot function without public trust. Justice becomes optional, peace becomes fragile. So just to recap, this evening, I've made 5 polite, hopefully, suggestions for institutional investment. First, to strengthen peaceful dispute settlement before disputes become wars. Second, to close the remaining gaps in accountability. Third, to build new institutions for emerging challenges. Fourth, to strengthen common security by clarifying the existing legal limits on the exercise of the veto. And fifth, to protect the institutions and people that make justice possible.
Thank
So
you.
I would like to just thank you very much for the time. I'm sorry if I went a little bit over, but I look forward to the question and answer, and we'll include some resources in the chat as well. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rebecca. Well done. Yeah, mostly I agree with you that we do need all these international criminal court and other ICJ and all to enforce law. But as you said yourself, the biggest problem lies in implementation. And we have to see how we can implement them and not carry on going to continuing wars and militarism. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Our next speaker is Sean English, a former director of the Free University of Ireland, former coordinator, the Study of Peace program, author of The Collapse of the War System. And personally, I know him for decades and decades. So please welcome Sean English.
Thank you very much, Vijay, and thank you for inviting me to contribute to the conference. I don't know whether my slideshow was up on the screen, Bernie. Can people see that slideshow?
I can.
Yes, okay. I'm going to find it very hard to follow on Richard and Rebecca's contribution. And I think we could spend all our time going back over those, but I'll make my contribution anyway. I would like to start by saying how much I like the theme of the conference that Vijay has organised, Wars, Inequality and Poverty. I think everyone involved in the peace and justice and environmental movements will be aware that these areas are intrinsically interlinked within the vicious cycles of violence and exploitation in our societies, both structural and direct. I've been working on a paper entitled The 10 Myths of the Just War and Militarized Security. And I want to briefly outline 2 of the 10 myths that I think are directly related to the very challenging themes of the conference, and finish it by outlining the approach of Lex in Essentium, an Irish peace movement, and to identify an ideology which I call the ideology of warism, which brings us back to the main theme of the conference. But before going on to look at the 2 specific areas in the 10 myths, I would like to identify the outline and the framework of my approach. The first framework concerns the awareness that we all have in relation to the extraordinary scientific and technological changes that have taken place in recent times. These changes have affected every aspect of human society and culture. In this context, we should be aware that today we are part of the inheritors, the children, or possibly the victims of what I call or identify as the first global techno-scientific civilization.
Sean, would you mind putting it on slideshow so that we can see the slides properly?
Oh yes, sorry. How do I do that? Let me see. Slideshow. Can you not see the slides? No.
You can see them, but they would be bigger if it was on slideshow.
Let me layout.
So at the bottom right of your screen, Sean, there's a thing that looks like a screen. Just click on that.
Slideshow stage, yeah.
That's it.
That's the one. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sean.
Now, my problem is from that. Oh, yes. I don't know how to go back now. Yeah, so I see, can I move forward on that? Yeah. Historians in the future, I think, will look back at this period in history and will identify the emergence of the first global civilization, whether they call it techno-scientific or not. But the developments and the characteristics of this techno-scientific civilization have created a set of unprecedented forces of change. And these forces can be harnessed in the most positive and creative ways, or they can be used in the most negative and destructive ways. In this context, we are in a struggle for survival on many fronts, and the negative implications of which are hard to imagine. We may well be living through what could be called an axial age of human history. And an axial age has been identified with a fundamental paradigm change in human understanding. We in the peace and justice movements have got to hope that this paradigm change will be for the better and will include the positive virtues that we as humans are capable of. That this global techno-scientific civilization will stand or fall, survive or collapse on its values. But given the realities of the world we live in today, the creation of a human-centered civilization seems almost like a utopian dream. But this is the challenge that we as individuals and organizations working for a better world have to face. And I just want to outline the second framework of my approach, which is connected to this. We are aware that all over the world, there are people and organizations working for a better world to build the foundations. And we can say that the general principles and structures of this better world are reasonably easy to identify because the principles have been handed down to us by previous generations of individual peace activists who rejected war and the war system in its totality, who promoted justice, who condemned exploitation and poverty in all their formats. Many of these activists, including the people who have organized this conference and people who have come to the conference, have worked for decades to promote the principles of peace and justice and the possibilities of peaceful coexistence and a better world. We in the peace movements are reasonably clear about the vision we have because we know that a better world must include less violence, less injustice, less hate, less inequality, and by implication must include more peace, more justice. We could summarize the outline of our approach for a better world. From a religious perspective, quite simply, more love and less hate. From a philosophical perspective, we could say more wisdom and less ignorance. From a political perspective, we can say from an economic perspective, all those balances of forces. But in each of these areas, we know that the scales or the balances are always seem to be in favor of the negativities and against the positives. At a global level, it would seem that we as a species are trapped in some form of feedback loop or vicious circle that we cannot seem to break free from. The forces of hate, the forces of fear, and the forces of intolerance always seem to be getting the upper hand. But we must hold on to the belief and the hope that a better world is possible and is achievable. The blueprint for this better world is to be found in the religious and wisdom traditions that we have inherited. And the best we can do is to build on those foundations, is from the various peace movements, is to promote as widely as possible the importance of the inheritance of these values. This is the task of each generation of people who believe that a better world is possible and are active in the various peace, justice and environmental movements around the world. And I love the quote from Margaret Mead, a cultural anthropologist: "Never doubt that a small group of people, committed citizens, can change the world. Indeed, it may be the only thing that ever has."
Thank you.
This brings me to a more sensitive area in that failure of the peace movements and the individuals and the individuals involved in these movements have failed to break out of the vicious cycles that support the war system security. This war system is embedded in what I call the standard narratives of our realities. War is normalized, rationalized, and romanticized. So the narrative of peace is used to support the narrative of war. I don't like using this quote, but it does reflect some of the frustrations of the peace movements from the 1930s. And the quote is: "People and organizations who are for peace in times of peace are worse than useless if they are for war in times of war." I would like to just identify the importance of what I call the standard narratives of our reality. The standard narrative of just war and military security, like any narrative, is constructed around the meaning of language. The peace movement needs to reject the language and the meaning of terms such as security, defense, terrorism, pacifism, appeasement, the laws of war. We must reject the standard meanings given to these concepts, because if we accept the meanings of these concepts, we will never break out of the vicious cycles that support the standard narratives of the ideology of war. A good example of the manipulation of this language is the European Peace Facility. I don't know if many people know about it, but the European Peace Facility has a budget of 17 billion from the European Union. We know from research that 90% of this fund is spent on the purchase of weapons and the funding of war. So the European Peace Facility is not a peace facility at all, it's a war facility. This is a good example of the manipulation of language that George Orwell identified in his classic novel 1984. And again, in relation to the drive to rearm Europe and the policies of militarizing the European Union, many of the European leaders do see themselves as decent, honest people who are doing what they believe is right. But Europe has gone through this process twice before with disastrous consequences for the people of Europe. Historians have identified these periods as the March of Folly for the First World War, sleepwalking to disaster for the Second. The Finnish government now brags that they have constructed nuclear shelters for 95% of their population, but they're very reluctant to say what that population will do when they emerge from their nuclear shelters after a nuclear war in Europe. Today, the leaders of the European Union and NATO are openly planning to be ready for war with Russia by 2030. It is hard to underestimate the dangers and the insanity of planning for a nuclear war in Europe and believing this time it will be different. But this is the strategy that is accepted now almost without question in the bubble of reality or unreality that is the standard narrative of defence. That word policy of the EU. These are the leaders who've rejected the possibilities of diplomacy, conflict resolution, common security, the UN peacekeeping. So I believe that the struggle for a better world will be won or lost in the area of language, meaning, and the narratives that are manufactured to shape our realities.
Thank you.
Yeah. So in this context, President Trump has made one small contribution when he changed the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War. It would be an achievement if we could get the British government and the European Union governments to make a similar transition to reality. Because my work on the 10 myths of the just war and militarized security was inspired by the launch of the Lex Innocentium in 21st century, the law of the innocents. A small group of peace activists here in Ireland rediscovered an ancient Irish law from the year 697 AD. This ancient law, Adonan's law, made it a crime to kill women and children and non-combatants in time of war. We like to refer to this Lex Innocentium 697 AD as the First Geneva Convention. The history and the background of the Lex Innocentium can be found on the Lex website. But I just go on to the core. The core features of Lex Innocentium are very clear. We have updated the ancient law in the spirit of the original, and it states that war is a crime against humanity. War is a crime against the earth and all its living creatures. War is a crime against the future generations. Many people who cling to the idea of a just war or a war of defense find Lex Innocentium very challenging. But we are clear and unambiguous in our beliefs that the modern institutionalized war system of security is Earth's greatest enemy. We cannot continue to justify, rationalize, and normalize war. And this is our generation's challenge and responsibility. In this context, I want to finish by looking at and identifying what I call the ideology of warism. This ideology of warism is one of the vicious circles that we in the peace and justice movements will need to challenge and reject in all its manifestations. And the dangers from the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex were identified by President Eisenhower, as Vijay has said, over 50 years ago. But these dangers and all their manifestations have come a long way since that. The modern institutionalized war system has evolved its own very own ideological self-justifications. The belief in the war system of security has all the characteristics of any ideology, and as such should be identified in its own right as the ideology of warism. Like any other ism of the modern world, it will have its fair share of true believers. But we in the peace movements must recognize that the ideology of war, the narratives of war, the echo chamber of war has insinuated itself into almost every area of our own understanding. The ideology of warism is supported, of course, by the standard narratives of the bloated military and industrial complex and the nexus of organizations, institutions, and individuals that benefit directly from the advantages created by the war system. Warism as an ideology could be seen as the opposite to the concept of pacifism. In this context, warism is based on the ideological belief that organized violence is a fundamental force in the evolution of human society and social systems. Again, the people who believe that a better world is possible will have to confront the fundamentals of warism and its ideologies. From a peace perspective, the debate, we have to agree the debate on the nature of war and peace and justice and injustice does open a Pandora's box of competing ideologies and theologies. But we in the peace and justice movements must believe that a better world is possible, that human ingenuity and creativity is not beyond establishing and sustaining security systems that do not require the war, that resort to war, that human compassion and empathy is not beyond creating social systems that do not require the exploitation of any section of society, that does not require the type of industrialized abuse of our fellow creatures for food production, that human survival instinct is not beyond creating sustainable environments. The modern war system may or may not have its roots back in the Neolithic period, but that time for Neolithic thinking is way past its sell-by date. This awareness is, as the great Russian author and pacifist Leo Tolstoy stated, should be identified as a law of human existence on the same level as the law of gravity in the physical world. People have a right to say that they do not believe in the law of gravity, but that does not invalidate the law. We who believe in the possibilities of a better world must break out of these vicious cycles of war, inequality, and poverty, and the belief systems that support them. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Sean. Yeah, I agree. A better world is possible if we try for it and get rid of the militarized world we live in. Okay, our last speaker is Alan Ben Mayer, former professor, International Relations, New York's University Center for Global Affairs, Senior Fellow, World Policy Institute, author of A Strategy for Implementing the Reconciliation Process between Israel and Palestine. Please welcome Alan Ben Mayer. Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vijay Mehta, for giving me the opportunity to share my views on these most critical issues of our time: war, inequality, and poverty. The question, as was rightfully put, is how to get out of this vicious cycle. However difficult it may seem, we have no choice but to take every conceivable measure to tackle this formidable task, because otherwise we surrender to a future dictated by fear, violence, and instability. You know, we are living through a moment of cascading disorder that feels like the most unstable period since 1945. War, inequality, and poverty are no longer confined to faraway places. They are intertwined into a single global crisis. What makes this moment really distinctive is not the scale of poverty, which 1.1 billion people worldwide, but the collapse of the system meant to prevent it. New world disorder, in which shocks multiply while shock observers of a global cooperation, democracy, and social contracts eroded in plain sight. There are 5, in my view, structural forces that have converged to bring us to this sad reality. First, power has fragmented. The brief unipolar moment after the Cold War has given way to a crowded field of major and middle powers competing through sanctions, tariffs, energy, and supply chains, and tools of coercion. The result is a geopolitical confrontation that corrodes trust, stalls climate and arms control, and turn regional conflicts into proxy wars. Order increasingly reflects power, not law. Second, inequality and economic uncertainty have hollowed out social contracts. The global financial crisis, the pandemic, and inflation shocks have left societies with rising debt, staggering wages, and soaring wealth concentration. For many, life has grown more insecure even as aggregate wealth has increased. That insecurity, politically explosive, it fuels grievances, empowers demagogues, and weakens democratic consensus. In a fragile state, it raises the risk of collapse in wealthier ones. It drives zero-sum politics and strongman leadership. Third, ecological breakdown has become a central driver of conflict. Climate change fuels extreme weather, water scarcity, and food insecurity. Where livelihoods collapse or land dries up, communities face displacement, recruitment by armed groups, and violent competition over resources. Fourth, we are witnessing the erosion of democratic institutions alongside the rise of dictatorships. Parliaments are sidelined, courts politicized, term limits dismantled, and independent media suppressed. Leaders who cannot deliver prosperity turn to repression and scapegoating. In such a system, human rights violations are not aberration, they are instrument of control. Finally, technological disruptions has transformed information space into a battlefield. Digital platforms are exploited to spread disinformation, polarize societies, and mobilize extremism. Cyber operations blur the line between war and peace, while AI-enabled propaganda erodes trust in institutions and truth itself. We can see these failures vividly in three crises. Consider Gaza. After years of blockade, repeated wars, and systematic poverty, Israel's wars in Gaza has produced mass displacement, extreme hunger, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure on a staggering scale. Entire neighborhoods have been flattened, hospitals and universities reduced to rubble, and an already devastating economy has collapsed into widespread starvation and death. Just imagine, over 73,000 were killed and more than 100,000 injured. And taken together, this constitutes, in my view, nothing short of genocide. The West Bank, meanwhile, is experiencing its most severe wave of displacement and settler violence since 1967. International law is invoked but ignored, and accountability is absent. Gaza and the West Bank reflect, in my view, our moral bankruptcy and expose the emptiness of humanitarian rhetoric. Sudan is another tragic failure of our shared humanity. A brutal struggle between rival armed factions have plunged the country into one of the world's largest humanitarian catastrophes. Cities have been bombarded, hospitals attacked, and communities terrorized along ethnic lines. Millions have been displaced or forced into neighboring states. Yet, international engagement remains minimal while arms continue to flow. And then, take the Ukraine. 4 years into a full-scale war, The country faces entrenched battle lines, shattered infrastructure, millions of refugees, and a traumatized generation. The conflict has remilitarized Europe, revived nuclear fears, and deepened global energy and food shocks. It has also reinforced global division, raising fundamental questions about whether brute force will again be accepted as a legitimate instrument of power. These crises are not isolated. They reveal a broader pattern, an international community that documents, debates, and deplores, but rarely acts to prevent or stop conflicts. The problem is not lack of information, it is simply lack of will. The United Nations Security Council adopts resolutions that are often ignored. Peacekeeping missions are deployed with inadequate mandates and resources. Humanitarian appeals are chronically underfunded, forcing impossible choices. Meanwhile, double standards, demanding accountability from adversaries while accusing allies, undermining the credibility of international law. Now, how can we break this vicious cycle? At least 6 decisive actions, in my view, are essential. First, we must redesign international cooperation to make it consequential rather than symbolic. When a great power rivalry paralyzes the global institutions, conditions of middle powers and regional organizations must enforce arms embargoes, ensure civilian protections, and mediate conflicts. Protections cannot depend on single veto. Second, we must rebuild social contracts by confronting inequality, progressive taxation, strong safety nets, universal health and education, and investment in job-creating sectors are essential to reduce grievances that fuel extremism. Third, climate action must be treated as a core security priority. Peace and development strategies must include enforceable provision on land, water, and resources, backed by serious funding. Deliberate environmental destruction should be prosecuted as a major, I repeat, major crime. Fourth, we must defend democracy and civic space as a preventive tools. Arms transfer, trade preferences, and security cooperation should be conditioned on respect for human rights and the rule of law. At the same time, we must support journalists, activists, and legal institutions that document abuses and hold power accountable. Fifth, we need a clear rule for the information space, greater transparency, limits on disinformation, and international norms on cyber activities are necessary to protect democratic systems from manipulation. Finally, we must revive humanitarian and accountability. This means predictable multi-year funding for major crises and a firm rejection of starvation, siege, and mass displacement as a tools of war. International and domestic courts must be strengthened so that those responsible for atrocities face real consequences. Asset freezes, arrest warrants, and political isolation. Remember, impunity fuels the vicious cycle. Accountability is how we break it. Now, all of this will face resistance from those who benefit from the current disorder. But the costs of prevention are far lower than the catastrophic costs we are already paying in lives, resources, and the erosion of our values. You see, in the final analysis, the vicious cycle is of our own making. It was built through decisions, omissions, and compromises. That is precisely why it can be dismantled if we summon the will to act, mobilize our resources, and reclaim our shared humanity with resolve, anchoring the future in dignity and justice. I thank you, Mehta, for giving me this opportunity.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. Yeah, we need to dismantle all these obstacles and get out of the vicious circle. Thanks for your presentation. Now, it is time for the delegates or the people who are attending the conference to come up with either questions for the speakers or brief comments, 2-3 minutes comments. So the floor is open. Who will be the first to ask a question?
I would like some brief. Sorry, please.
Okay,
Eddie.
go on.
Please, Eddie.
Go on, Eddie, go on.
I go. Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much for all the speakers. It was really, really stimulating and enriching. Just to refer to the comments by two of the particular speakers, the first one in order of how it occurred is Richard Falk. I was intrigued by his articulation of, in a sense, the threat that China is now creating to America. And I was reading just before the event started. In 1850, William Evans Arthur, a congressman, said, "The ark of safety, the anointed civilizer, the only visible source of light and heat and repose in the dark, discordant and troubled world is America." And it was just occurring to me as Richard was speaking that there must be a powerful underlying psychological reason why, if I am part of a country which believes I'm the anointed, and if I listen to somebody like Richard who is saying I have a lot to learn from China, there's almost a real fear almost will emerge, because China then becomes a threat to my self-sacrosanct notions of myself. So that was just one thing maybe Richard might respond to.
Yeah.
The other thing, just quickly, I was really intrigued by Sean's presentation as well. And, you know, we hear this thing, war on drugs, war on terror. But what Sean is after bringing in is there's another war. There's a war on language. And it occurs to me that that war on language has been going on for an awful long time. And it has fed into where we now find ourselves at. This incredible corruption of this extraordinary thing called language. So anyway, these were just
Thank you.
thoughts.
Thank you. Richard first and then Sean.
Yes, well, thank you very much for that challenging question that I had not thought about previously. The idea that you projected of America as the great hope of the world was something that was given birth at the founding of the United States. The whole idea of being the city on the hill and an American exceptionalism, which was always a partial myth. They were the founders of the American Republic were slaveholders. That included George Washington, the first president. And they had driven the native peoples into virtual oblivion. In other words, the country was founded on a myth of exceptionalism that continues despite the actions that some of the speakers have alluded to, premised on a militarist coming out from the shelter of isolationism after World War II and trying to take over the world on the basis of this kind of self-promotion as continuing to be the best of sovereign states. Even in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, there was no self-criticism. See, and one of the dangers of that kind of psychological hegemonic outlook is a kind of divine right to dominate others and to bring others the benefits of this supposedly superior civilization, while in reality gaining wealth and power over them. So this whole idea of Pax Americana emerging out of World War II is an enormous mythological distortion of the political realities and disguised the foundation of what we've been calling the vicious cycle of war, poverty, and inequality.
Okay, thank you. Sean?
Well, thanks very much. Yeah, very briefly, yeah, the conflict around language was identified by Pope Leo there recently in one of his statements, where he's identified the issue of language, how language is abused, as a very important area in what was happening today in the world. I mean, and that's why I picked up on some of those. Who is a terrorist? I mean, the standard narrative is the terrorist is, we have this standard, but somebody has constructed that narrative. The Israeli army don't see themselves as terrorists. They see themselves as fighting a just war. So that is important. I mean, the quote, I just can't get the quote from Pope Leo. It was a very strong quote. In an Irish, I have a quote from an Irish revolutionary. It's easy to spot the terrorist. He is the one with the little bomb. But that's how language can be abused. And thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. We got two more hands. First, Clive Wilson, and then Grace Southern. So, Clive, where are you?
I'm here, Vijay.
Okay. And Anne Garrett, that's the third one.
Thank you for a wonderful conference, and thank you for the speakers so far for their inspiring input. And what emerged for me out of the conversation is the clear need and opportunity for some really powerful leadership. Somebody who can articulate and really convey a vision of world peace, where instead of diverting funds for armaments and wars and things like that, we can actually fund the things that really matter. And I'm curious as to where that leadership might come from. Will it be from a future Director General of the United Nations? Will it be a current leader like Mark Carney, or dare I say it, Andy Burnham? I did have some faith in Jacinda Ardern some time ago, but I'm curious as to where our speakers think that leadership might come from, because it is greatly needed and it's a fabulous opportunity for somebody to put the world on the course it ought to be on.
Thank you, Clive. Rebecca, would you like to answer that question? Rebecca, are you still there?
Yes, I am. I had to reconnect through multiple devices here. Can you see and hear me?
Sorry?
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I think that's a fascinating question. And I think the answer is multifold. So while Mark Carney famously made the case, which many of us deeply agree with, that we have a revolution of middle powers, we have a revolution and a reconstitution and a reimagination, perhaps, of the way that states themselves are coming together and asserting their power, I think we also see the rise of non-state actors. And so you mentioned several inspirational leaders, politicians, elected officials. I would like to call to our recognition an example that came up last year, where I think we saw some seismic, seminal global change. And that was with an advisory opinion before the International Court of Justice on the obligations of states with regards to climate change. And that was seminal not only in the consequence of a decision, reaffirming that the right to a clean, sustainable, and healthy environment is a human right, reminding us of the rights of future generations, but also the way that it came about. It was manifested by, first, youth from small Pacific Island states who mobilized, who entreated their governments first to take a question before the International Court of Justice. Then that decision became the first ever unanimous referral of the UN General Assembly to the International Court of Justice. And all it happened because of those that we think of traditionally perhaps as among the least powerful, who recognized an existential threat, in their case, the threat of climate change. And that same mobilization we do see happening in peace communities, we do see happening in individual conflicts, whether they be in Gaza or Sudan or Ukraine or elsewhere, as well as globally. And I think, of course, of the incredible importance of youth and civil society mobilization in the anti-nuclear campaigns that persist today. And where this is especially important to bear in mind is, I mentioned where I'm coming from. And that white building across the street has limited access for civil society. Those of us without the appropriate credentials can't always participate in proceedings and are frequently barred from the door and have to knock on the window and seek a key. And that's something I think very important to bear in mind, that civil society working in tandem with states, working in tandem with other constituencies, private sector, legal actors, et cetera, is the only way I think that we can achieve some of these goals. So thank you for the opportunity to contribute to that.
Thank you so much. Now we got Gray Southern and then Anne Garrett. Gray, it's your turn.
Thank you, Vijay, for the opportunity of asking a question. These very amazing array of input we've got here, and it highlights the complexity of what we're dealing with, and all sorts of perspectives can contribute. I want to address the contribution that Sean has presented, a number of important issues, but I want, particularly, he refers to the techno civilization, which points towards a field of increasing interest called the multi-crisis, or sometimes the omni-crisis, and highlights an enormous range of different issues, of which climate change and pandemics is just one hint, and the possibility of threats and enormous benefits coming from these areas, and the call for increasing call for international cooperation as the basis for addressing these threats. At a recent Shangri-La conference, which was on defense, highlighted by Alexis from the US, talking about his militaristic agendas. Alongside him was a speaker, a keynote speaker, To Lam, president of Vietnam, who addressed that very same issue that Jean was addressing, and the need for cooperation. So that message is coming through in a range of different ways. And I was just wondering, Sean, do you have any overview of where these impulses are coming? I've heard a number of major speeches that address that, and we could get an idea of just where this movement of promoting international cooperation exists and how it could be highlighted and expanded on.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. No, I'm not sure if I have an answer. I mean, it is a very kind of general area of discussion, but there is something happening. We are living through an age that we're not sure the power of the science and technology and how it can be used for the better. That's our, people like on this conference who believe in the possibilities of peace and social justice. I don't know how we're going to affect that if we can, because it's a power that's running away at the moment. So I don't know if I've any particular answer to what you're saying there.
Okay, all right.
Sorry about
Okay, thank you. Anne Garrett?
Yes, thank you for some very excellent speeches and a lot of information, all extremely thought-provoking. But the thing that struck me most about all the speeches was what you said, Sean English, was that the peace movements have failed. All my life I'd been on Aldermaston marches when I was young as a student. I demonstrated against the Vietnam War. We did get, some end to the war, but it was far too late. Too much suffering, had taken place. And now I'm on Gaza marches and vigils nationally and locally. I want to be out there expressing my concerns and what I feel, what CND, which I'm a member of, I'm Bromley, Secretary of Bromley, a CND. What the peace, I agree with you, the peace movements have generally failed, to prevent war. We're out there trying to express ourselves. So, Sean, what advice would you give, to the peace movements? What can we do? What more can we do?
Thank you, Anne. I will invite Alan Ben-Meir to give us a comment on how we can rejuvenate the peace movement.
What's in it?
Sorry?
Well, we have to look at the international disorder that currently exists and ask ourselves the question, what is going to take? And we mentioned earlier, we have a global crisis of leadership. So, to rejuvenate a peace movement, you need to have also leadership. And where do we have leadership? So, for example, the United States has been leading the West, has been leading the world as the greatest power. What is happening here in the United States? We basically, with the advent of Trump administration, we have lost that capacity, that ability to lead. We are no longer trusted. So what I'm saying here, to revive peace movement, you are going to need to begin with a leader or leaders who are committed to the welfare and well-being of the people themselves. And that is, they need to provide answers, not how to mitigate conflict, how to deal with poverty, how to deal with the adequacies of our systems. That is, peace movement cannot operate in vacuum. It has to have a purpose. And that purpose needs to provide it. That is a framework that needs to be framed by leadership. And that is a problem for us. You cannot create a peace movement in vacuum. And so what I'm saying is we have to look at our socioeconomic conditions today, and we can point out what is missing. We know what is missing. Now, how do you mobilize the public? And that is mobilization require leadership. And then you have to ask the question where leadership come from. Leadership come from the people. That is, for example, if you have a breakdown in the system, you have an opportunity for a breakthrough. We have today a breakdown in the global system. There is an opportunity for new leadership to emerge. That kind of leadership can mobilize the masses for a purpose, that is a peaceful movement. So we are lacking the various elements that can allow us to revive such peace movement. And that is really the problem we face today. And that is we see increase in conflict, increase in violence, increase in wars, and less emphasis on peace and reconciliation.
Thank you. Richard, how can we rejuvenate peace movement?
You're asking me, Vijay?
Yeah. Yeah, you've been long enough on the track. You should know.
I think we all agree that some kind of creative leadership responsive to this agenda of crises is needed. But to say it's needed is not sufficient without showing how it can come about when the structures of power are intent on suppressing the very kind of benevolent leadership that is needed. I pointed to China because it is an established center of power and authority and relative sanity. It sees the dangers. One of the chat comments pointed out that China, for all that I said, still spends a lot of its resources on military preparedness, but it's under threat from the US and from Taiwan and so on, so that it's used that capability in a defensive mode. And I think listening to China is the beginning of forging also a civil society responsive leadership, not exaggerating China's virtues and overlooking their internal issues of suppressing minorities and dissent. But on the global stage, they seem to be receptive to an agenda of adaptation that would at least start us down the road toward a better human future.
Thank you. Norbert?
Just one more point.
Okay, yeah, carry on.
The last point is it's relatively easy to say what should happen. but how we get transition to make it a political project that has a chance of becoming real is, I think, the most fundamental challenge that we who are gathered here at this conference confront.
Thank you, Richard. Norbert?
Very good. Yeah, I just want to point out that apart from leaders, one of which we have in the peace movement, or several of them, we need infrastructure and tools. And as you know, I'm advocating especially Better World Info, which you find again in the chat, because it could be such a useful infrastructure, apart from the ones you have, because it's quite unifying. It's a bit like a platform for peace activists. And I guess I only had contact with 2 of you so far, very sad. And it's also an alternative Wikipedia for a better world, focusing on informative guides, plus having a focus on hand-picked links, quite a few of them, as you know. So check it out, get in touch, would greatly appreciate it. So sorry, it's just a 2-minute shout out and not a question, but I think it's very relevant that we need to share knowledge, that we have platforms, and I suggest you should check out Better World Info. Thank you.
Thanks, Norbert. Yeah, it's because I've been on Norbert's website, World Info, and it's got over 30,000 links on different peace projects, and also he's got most of the people who are in the peace movement, their bios and what they have done and things like that. So it's worth a visit to his website. Okay, Gray Southern again.
Oh,
Sorry, Gay. Just hold on. Paul Mallet first.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentations. I think the issues of at hand were extremely well articulated, and the solutions are very powerful. It always, as we have stated many times, raises the question of implementation. And if we look at the problem, I might suggest that we do default a little bit to the glass being half full. In other words, solutions to the problems probably on a line, as spectrums start at transactional at the left-hand side, for example, which default to power. And then on the right-hand side, the relational. Without the relational component, and even with the power components or the transactional components, this does not mitigate hate, whatever, and sowing the seeds for future conflict. So I would suggest that, on this line, above the line, of course, is justice, the institutional law, the courts, everything that we've spoken of, which are very good. But we certainly do have to look at below the line, which are the relational things, which really are the foundations that are going to make everything work. And on the relational side, probably the dominant factor is culture. The cultures we have and the cultures that we want, and how we can actually change them in that respect. Social responsibility, peace operations, ethics and values, probably primarily to start with education. But we do have a very, very useful UN resolution, 53243, on Program of Action for Cultures of Peace, which are something that probably, if we build suitable peace architectures, and we do this, and we do have them, and they are around, that are going to look at creating these kind of institutions, ministries, and infrastructures that are going to look a little bit more deeply into the relational part of things. So I would just suggest that these cultures of peace and these architectures have to come into greater balance with all the transactional and power generated, justice solutions and accountability that we have. So thank you kindly on that.
Thank you, Paul. Rebecca, would you like to comment on Paul Mallett's about culture of peace? Are you there, Rebecca?
I am here. I would say that a culture of peace, I was speaking in my earlier comments about the kaleidoscope and the fabric that is necessary to build peace politically and in terms of policy, and how many different stakeholders that it involves. And when we look at a culture of peace, I think we can even embroider that fabric, if I'm not abusing a metaphor, further. We look at arts and cultural institutions. We look at local leaders. We look at parliamentarians. We look at all who are necessary to make communities, starting from the hyper-local, react and in fact anticipate, not just react, not just respond, the eminently global. And so I think what is really necessary is not just thinking in terms of geography, not just thinking in terms of geopolitical or economic configurations, but also really thinking in terms of who are the value additives, and who are the those who stand to lose the most, and those whose voices might be otherwise silenced. And that all contributes to a culture of peace, and that contributes before, during, and after conflict. In my country, in the United States, we used to have a quite sophisticated mechanism for legislative, judicial, and executive accountability with regards to early warning prevention of atrocities. That has been dismantled, but civil society is still continuing, including former government officials who have lost their jobs, and in fact, their positions no longer exist. And so it's incumbent upon all of us, whether it's marching, even if it does seem futile, or it is about hitting those phones to have another perhaps failed vote in my Congress regarding atrocities that are being perpetuated in this hemisphere or in the Middle East or elsewhere, to be a part of that fabric. So that isn't really a solution. It isn't a blueprint, but it is a commitment to be a part of that going forward.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Jamie, unmute yourself and speak. I can't hear you.
Hello. Can you hear me now, Vijay?
Yes, I can.
That's good. Thank you, delegates, for being here. I've been away. Vijay knows where I've been because I seem to always get myself in trouble. And he goes, well, why do you always get yourself in trouble? It's because sometimes the path of peace is a difficult one, and I do voluntary work with, I was working with the CND in Exeter in the peace shop. And that's why I met Vijay. He gave me his book, which is brilliant, I practice Qigong. I'm a Qigong practitioner, Wudang Qigong, and everything that I've been hearing, I will go to sleep tonight and I'll go up to the high spaces and I'll talk. For me, the erosion of societies and the erosion of peace is the absence of God. It's the absence of love and it's the increase of fear, which is, even talking, if I wasn't used to being on Zoom meetings, I wouldn't know how to approach or even speak, like you said, Rebecca, about nervous people being silenced, and in the city I live in, I'm constantly targeted by the Matrix, because I don't watch TV, so that becomes a problem. What seems outside is, i.e., the minority, need to be brought into the middle. There's two sides. There's always two sides to a story, but you know, I don't talk. I'm not going to talk much, but I'm doing a lot of peace work, you know. But ultimately, the war is within. Everyone, we know this. It's with internal, you know. And I've come up with an understanding that I've got a left-hand side of my brain and I've got a right-hand side of my brain, and down the middle there's a space where electricity fires across. Now, my concerns with what was going on with myself, for example, going through the judicial system in the city, was my concerns were I was getting targeted because they were trying to make me popular, i.e., nationalists got annoyed with me shining my light, shining my natural God-given light, and people, and I got hated on. Now, I appreciate the works that everyone does, you know, whether people are reporting. I appreciate Vijay, you know, he's been a dear friend. And I miss Brian. I hope Brian is okay in Scotland. I really support the idea of movements such as departments of peace, which Vijay is the founder of. You know, I even sent Vijay an email saying, "Will you mentor me?" But you know, we'll see what happens there. You know, but I'm willing to go to any lengths to connect people, you know, because I've taken notes. I will speak to my friends.
Jamie, thank you so much, because
yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think because we are here till 8 o'clock and there is only 7 minutes left. So I'm going to wrap up this. We can carry on for hours, but I'm going to wrap up this meeting by first of all thanking all the distinguished speakers, Richard Falk, Rebecca Shue, Sean English, Alan Van Meer, for your thought-provoking and engaging presentations. We have learned a few things from your valuable insight about wars and implementing solutions for ending militarism, inequality, and poverty. We'll be publishing the report of today's conference is in the next Uniting for Peace newsletter. So I request all the speakers to send their contribution. So thank you very much for all the speakers and for their contribution. Thank you very much to the committee, volunteers of Uniting for Peace, and all the contributors who made the question answer session a vibrant one and also made the evening a success. A word to the audience. I appreciate your tireless efforts in promoting and building a culture of peace. May I request you to take a brief moment to reflect on the conference. If you have been inspired by what we are doing, then engage, spread the word, inform and inspire others of the good work we are doing, and better still, become a supporter of Uniting for Peace and support our campaigns. And we are counting on your generous support. Let me say that today, private citizens have more power to do public good than ever before because of the rise of internet, campaigning, and the NGOs as a global movement in the developed and the developing world. Our strength is in building citizen power, as some speakers have also said, and leaders, and creating leaders by which we can shape our destinies and the future of the world. Let me reflect the power of one. All of us are very powerful. One voice can make an impact. One brick helps build a home. One candle lights the room. One smile conquers the gloom. One touch shows that you care. One life can make a difference. The power of one leads towards unity. as some people wanted, how can we unify the world? All of us have power to change the world. So, before you go, let me say that we all have some work to do, like join a peace movement, local or international, and have a petition to end war and get as much signature as possible against Gaza, West Bank, Ukraine, Iran, Sudan, etc. Contact your member of parliament or your senator, congressman to end all these wars and military expenses and a campaign for a department for peace. And boycott those organizations and people who profit from war. So you have to take to task your representative, congressman or senator, who is always rushing to war. And also, you have to condemn the propaganda of war, which is everywhere we hear, on the news, on the newspapers, on the television, everywhere. So we should challenge this propaganda. And let us also, when we do endless marches to stop peace, we should continue doing and increase them, because one march cannot finish, a single march cannot end wars. So, in conclusion, let me say that a better world is possible, and let's build it. And thank you very much for all of you. You've been a great audience and great speakers. And thank you very much for being here today. We hope to see you again at our next event. Good luck, best wishes. Keep on doing the work for peace. Okay, let me give you one quotation before all of you go. This is from His Holiness Dalai Lama. Because we think we are very small, each one of us. We are not. If you think you are too small to change the world, try sleeping with a mosquito. So we have all got the power to change the world. Okay, thank you very much for your attendance, and we hope to see you, inform you of our next event, and hope to see you again. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Vijay, may I say something?
Yeah, sure. Go on.
I have a friend called Asha.
Yeah.
Her father was a German prisoner of war and married an English woman. So that's a good way to start peace, isn't it? Germany and England, Britain united through a marriage.
Yeah.
And the fruit of their union is Asha. Asha's just been in Georgia promoting peace. She's somewhere in Lowestoft at the moment, going to festivals promoting peace, because she's had an inspiration that September the 11th this year should be the declaration of celebration of world peace, that we should say that this is going to be the beginning of world peace on the 11th of September. And the whole world is invited to this celebration, and it's going to be exactly where everyone is. Everyone's going to do it where they are on the 11th of September.
Thank you. Thank you, Lilius. Nancy.
So I would just like to invite you all to join in the celebration of peace on the 11th of September and remember Asha.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. Nancy? Hello. Okay,
hello.
Would you like to make a comment? She runs a very big organization in USA, Peace Alliance.
Well, thank you very much. This was really good, Vijay. I didn't really have any comments except to thank you. And I had put in the chat if anybody wants to sign up to endorse the Department of Peace Building. We take this information to Congress and we welcome individuals and organizations from anywhere throughout the world. And thank you again, Vijay.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Anybody else, or I'm going to otherwise end the meeting? Anyone else? Oh, yes. Ariam Kashyap. Yes. Gone. Gone, Ariam. Ariam.
Good evening. I am from Arundam Kashyap from India. Thank you
Yeah.
for this insightful discussion. Actually, I have the question, but time is all over. But just I want to say that the many of today's proposals depend on political will. How can ordinary citizen and civil society create enough constructive pressure for governments to adopt meaningful global governance reform?
Okay. Anyone like to take up this challenge? Richard, Sean, Alan? Anyone? That how
Yes,
can
please.
we?
Can I do it?
Sorry, Lilius, you like to speak?
Yes.
Okay, go on.
The population of the world at the moment is 8.3 billion people. If 8.3 billion people agree that we don't want war, we've got a chance.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lilius. It's a question of persuading these 8 billion and how to go about it. Yeah, okay, but it's a good suggestion.
Well, we have
Thank
to
you.
keep talking about it and tell them. There was a cartoon where a peace activist was talking to a normal member of the public and saying, "Why don't you do something?" And the person said, "Well, I'm all by myself and I can't do anything." And the peace activist said, "Actually, there are 8.3 billion of us."
Yeah, good.
We are not alone.
No, we are not. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. And I really need to end the meeting because our time is up. Okay, bye-bye and see you again.
Bye-bye, Vijay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.